for being here. Recording in progress. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Madison, for the introduction and for all of our housekeeping. Thank you so much for hosting us virtually. So my name is Chelsea Davis, and I am with the Women's Center of Tarrant County. Madison is going to be keeping an eye on the chat, but I will too. So please, I'm going to be asking for your input and for you to share throughout today. And I'll be sharing a little bit about myself and my own experiences with vicarious trauma today. So please use that chat and please, feel free to unmute and chime in. I'm pretty comfortable with that kind of casual flow and conversation. It's hard to do virtually, but I think we can achieve some of that, open discussion vibe. So like I said, my name is Chelsea Davis. I'll tell you a little bit about me and then a little bit about the Women's Center, just so you have an idea of who I am and where I'm coming from. So I am an LMSW. I actually live in Denton. If you guys, really looked hard, if any of you are located actually at the hotel, you can probably see my house. I don't live far. I live up there. I love it. Lived in Denton for almost 15 years. I work down here in Fort Worth at the Women's Center of Tarrant County. I am the trauma trainer for our Rape Crisis and Victim Services Department. So the Women's Center, our mission is to inspire and empower women, men, and children to overcome violence, crisis, and poverty. So we kind of have a wraparound approach to that. First, I'm going to turn off my phone ringer. I just heard my phone ring and it distracted me. So I haven't done virtual in a while. I'm a little rusty with some of the little bits and details. Okay. So we have a wraparound approach to accomplishing this mission. We have a general counseling department that helps with just a variety of mental health needs. We have an employment solutions to help with job security, financial security. And then our largest department is our Rape Crisis and Victim Services Department. So we are the Rape Crisis Center for Tarrant County. Most people here are probably Texas. This is the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault Conference. But if you're not very familiar, Tarrant County is up here in the DFW area. We're kind of the FW of DFW. We have Fort Worth as our, hub of Tarrant County. And we serve as the rape crisis for that county. And we have our 24/7 hotline, our hospital accompaniment, advocates, therapists, case managers, legal assistants for free for any victims of sexual assault, sexual abuse, or other violent crime. Within that department is our violence prevention and education. That's the team that I work on. So I specialize in professional trainings on issues of trauma. I help organizations become trauma informed, working with specific types of trauma, interventions with survivors of trauma. And I also have sort of expanded into what I'm talking about today, which is the trauma that we take on as professionals in this field and how we are impacted by that and what we need to feel supported. So that is what I'm going to be talking about today. We call it the secondhand smoke of working with survivors, the vicarious trauma that we take on as professionals, the secondhand stress that we take on as professionals working with victims of crime, survivors of trauma, and just navigating all of the emotions that come along with that. So we're going to start with just making sure we've all got the same working definition of trauma and how it impacts us. And then we'll discuss how that vicarious trauma impacts us personally and professionally, and what are some strategies to addressing that. Okay. So let's start with definition, impact, and prevalence of trauma. I think this is maybe going to be something we know, but I always like to start with a foundational definition. So we're kind of working off the same springboard, okay? So this definition comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. I like to say they wrote the book on trauma-informed care. They literally wrote a book called Trauma-Informed Care in Behavioral Health Settings. This is their definition, and I really appreciate it. I feel like it covers just about everything I'd want a definition to cover. It can be an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances like an environment that are harmful, life-threatening, and have lasting adverse effects on our entire being. emotional, mental, physical, social, right? Trauma is a bit like that visual of the iceberg. We might only see the tip of the iceberg for somebody, and we don't know everything that they've gone through, everything that they've been through, because it sort of lives inside of them, and it may not surface until something triggers it, or we may not know it until they feel safe enough to share it with us. I forgot to put his picture in here, but I always put a picture of my dog, Asher. He's a border collie blue heeler. He is alive, but I'm going to tell you kind of a sad story. So and it's my good metaphor for trauma. So my dog Asher was hit by a car a few years ago. And so we rushed him to the animal ER, and they had to do these x-rays on him. So the vet comes back to the room and is telling us, hey, we're looking at his x-rays. He doesn't have anything broken, but there's a lot of metal shards throughout his torso. And the vet was very confused by that. Looking at the x-rays, just bits of metal. And we said that makes sense because he was shot a few years ago, right? So this dog is alive, but has been hit by a car and has been shot. He got shot with a shotgun a few years ago. And if you know anything about shotguns, you know that the shrapnel spreads, right? Kind of explodes. So not only is he coming into the animal ER because he got hit by a car, but he's got this other traumatic experience in his history. And that's how trauma works, right? My dog, Asher, sweet baby, had a traumatic experience, and the impact of it spread throughout his whole body and lived inside of him. And unless somebody knew his story or looked at him with the right lens, which would be an x-ray in this metaphor, looked at him through the right lens, they would never see that trauma, right? So we're working with clients who, until they feel safe enough to tell us, or until we use the right lens and asking the right questions and looking at them with the right empathy and sensitivity, we may never see or know all of the impact, all of the traumatic impact that person carries with them. And trauma can be acute. So this is that event, right? It could be a one-time thing. It can be chronic. So it can be a series of events or an ongoing exposure to a type of trauma. And that can also be complex. Complex trauma is when we've got multiple traumatic experiences, or we're in an environment that's traumatizing. There's ongoing exposure to multiple sorts of trauma. And it just feels like it's one after the other after the other. And when this is your experience with trauma, it makes it much harder for you to bounce back, right? You never really get a clean slate. You're always sort of on your, trying to come back from a previous traumatic experience, and it snowballs and impacts and accumulates. When I'm doing more general trainings on trauma, I always just take a minute to talk about intergenerational trauma. So the trauma that passes down through the home or through close networks. I talk historical trauma, understanding how oppression and systems of oppression and abuse throughout our history impacts us today, and then systemic trauma or institutional trauma. And that is those forms of oppression and abuse that exist in our systems and hurt marginalized and vulnerable people, and create this sense of feeling traumatized, feeling threatened, feeling like I'm having adverse impact. I'm going through something that's having an adverse impact on me, right? Just because of the system I'm operating in. Being a sexual violence prevention educator, being from a rape crisis center, we always want to look at the lens of sexual violence and interpersonal violence as a form of trauma. So again, this might be something you already know, but I want to make sure I'm staying true to my roots, being funded by the OAG, and make sure I'm getting that education out there about what is sexual assault, what is child sexual abuse and intimate partner violence, right? Sex without consent, where consent has been withdrawn or consent was gained through coercion. That's how we define sexual assault, right? The legal definition is any oral, anal, or vaginal penetration with a body part or an object being made to penetrate someone else. Child sexual abuse usually has that grooming process. Most of the victims know they're offenders. And then intimate partner violence is any of this violence between current or former intimate partners, right? And I have some stats there for you guys, but just want to make sure we're working with the same lens, seeing sexual violence and interpersonal violence as forms of trauma. So now let's start with, how does this trauma impact us? Okay, so we know that trauma impacts the way our brains function. I'm sure many of us, well, maybe I don't want to assume, maybe you haven't, maybe this is a new image for you, but if it's not, let me explain what you're looking at here. So you have two brain scans in front of you. The brain on the left is a healthy brain, and the brain on the right is someone who experienced severe abuse or neglect. Okay. So what we can see from this brain scan is that, first of all, our brains, a really simplified way to look at it is that our brains kind of have two systems, two sections, right? The upper brain and the lower brain. And the upper brain is where our social, emotional, and cognitive functioning lives. When we feel calm, when we feel cool, collected, that's the part of our brain that we're living in. And this is really where we want to be most of the time, okay? But when something makes us feel threatened, we jump to the lower brain. The lower brain becomes the boss, right? Well, the decision-making that happens in our lower brain is usually fight, flight, or freeze. It's not very complex. There's not a lot of rational decision-making, problem-solving, critical thinking. Those skills are up here. And when we feel threatened, we're using the lower brain. We're using the skills of where's the threat, fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, this is all good. We want our brains to do this. But what we know is that the theory of allostatic load or overload tells us that after enough long-term exposure to trauma, when our survival mode has to be in charge for a long period of time, it sort of alters the way we function, right? It affects the way our brain carries that load. We see a lot more activity falling onto the lower brain. The lower survival mode has to be in charge of a lot more often than it really ideally would be. So this brain on the left is a healthy brain, if you will. I guess, yeah, that's fair. I almost don't want to say healthy because it trauma, but I guess for this context, that word works. So this brain on the left is our healthy brain. And we can see where there's red is where there's activity. So if we look at the upper part of this brain, we see where those circles are. We see that there's lots of activity up here, okay? But if we compare that to this brain of someone who's experienced some severe trauma, we see significantly less activity up here, all right? But it's important to note that instead of this upper section of the brain being really, really active, the most active part of this person's brain is right down here. That is their lower brain. This is their survival mode. So this brain on the right, this is somebody living in survival mode. The most active in charge part of their brain is fight, flight, or freeze. We can compare that to this healthy brain on the left that has an active lower brain. We are always sort of ready to go into survival mode if we need to. But the difference is it's balanced. There's activity all over. This brain on the right that has that long-term exposure to trauma, they are going to have a much stronger, much more reactive survival mode. So if you've got a brain like the one on the left, we're talking this healthy brain, you've got a brain like the one on the left, and you're sitting in a room and somebody drops a book. You might jump and for a split second, feel yourself kind of clench up, get a little nervous, but within 2 seconds, probably less, you'd rationalize, it was just a book, I'm fine. Your upper brain would kick back in and say, it was just a loud noise, there's no threat here. And you'd move forward, you wouldn't even think about it. But if you've got a brain like the one on the right, where the most active part of your functioning is survival mode, and that book drops and you hear that loud bang, first of all, it's going to take you longer for your upper brain to kind of come back online and rationalize it was just a book, we're safe. And by the time that upper brain came back online and said that, your fight, flight, or freeze already kicked off. Your heart is racing, you're feeling hot, right? You're starting to feel a little out of control of your body. Everyone else in the room seems fine. You feel like you're panicking because that survival mode kicked in and acted where it thought it needed to act. We begin to move through life as if we are constantly having to be in survival mode. This is the neurological impact of trauma. And this creates behaviors in us. Because again, if we live like we're in survival mode, we're going to behave like everything's a potential threat. We're going to behave like everything is a little bit out to get us, and we've got to be on guard all the time. We've got to be ready to fight all the time. We've got to be ready to run. And it can just weigh on us. It does a lot of wear and tear on our socio-emotional well-being. But People are adaptive. Oh, wait, I want to make sure. Wait, one more point. I got a little too ahead of myself. So it affects our behaviors, right? It affects the way we behave. And it also changes the way we see the world. Okay. So we see our views, our entire mindset, our entire lens through which we interpret other people, situations, and ourselves. That changes, right? We begin to struggle with trusting other people, trusting ourselves, feeling safe, believing that we're safe. I'm sure we see a lot of this in the clients and victims that we work with. They have a mindset of, I'm not safe anywhere. I can't trust anybody. And frankly, most of their experiences have only verified that to them, that you can't trust anybody, that you can't expect anyone to have your back. You've got to look out for yourself. So we move through the world that way. But as I was saying, we do adapt. I believe that we are at our core an adaptive species. People like to say people are resilient, and that's true. But I think also people are just adaptive. We're going to cope and adapt with whatever we have to, right? People develop tools to adapt to and survive trauma. If someone's growing up in a chaotic home environment, if they grow up in a toxic or abusive environment, they will develop the tools and they're going to hone those survival tools to get through that. The problem is, though, when they are in a different environment, a healthier environment, a safer environment, a job, a relationship, anything, those are the tools they have. The tools they have are aggression, defiance, avoidance, right? The tools they have are hypervigilance or criticism. That's the tools they've developed. That's what's in their toolkit. And it's up to us as professionals to have an awareness of that, to have an awareness of the behaviors this person is exhibiting, the things this person is doing, the aggression they're showing me, the defiance. That is not something that's wrong with them. And instead, that is their resilience. They are doing the best that we can. They are doing the best that they can, right? So instead of, why can't you call me back? Why can't you show up to an appointment? Why can't you keep a job? Why can't you stay in a relationship without sabotaging it? Why can't you stop using whatever substance it is that you're using? Why can't you just get over it? Well, the truth is, for that person, for most of the clients that we work with, that is them dealing with it. We want them to deal with what they've been through. That's their way of doing it. That's their way to continue getting up every day and to continue functioning. Doesn't mean we give a green light to any sort of maladaptive coping mechanism, right? Thankfully, that's what therapy is for. But it means we recognize this is you doing the best that you can. This is your resilience in action. So when I am training agencies on trauma-informed care and how to be trauma-informed, these are the elements that we've got to have in place, right? I want to point out a few things here. So we've got safety and we have felt safety. So it's one thing for somebody to be safe, right? It's one thing for me to know you, the client, are safe in my office. We are safe in this building. We're safe in my car. You are safe being vulnerable with me. I'm a safe person that you can trust. And it's a total different thing for them to feel that. But if we know that our brain is going to be operating in survival mode until we feel safe, we know we've got to feel safe before we can get up to that social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. They're not going to get up here where we can do the rational problem solving, start thinking, okay, what is it you want to work on? What is it you need? What would you like me to help you with? We can't get to those conversations until they feel safe. So the top priority for us working with someone who's gone through trauma is, do they feel safe with us? And we do this by building trust, offering choices, making sure their voice is being heard. They feel empowered. They feel like they're an active partner in whatever services it is that we're providing for them. We have to have all of these present to be trauma informed. And then I mentioned that I do trainings for, like I said, agencies to be trauma informed. And this is the outline of trauma informed care that I use the most. So this also comes from Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. And it's 6 elements for agencies or organizations to be trauma informed. And some of this is going to sound like what we saw on that last slide. It's collaborating, seeing the survivor as an active participant in whatever it is we're working on. Their voice matters. They're the expert on what they've been through, and they have to be heard in this helping relationship. It also requires collaborating with other service providers. If you've been in the nonprofit world long enough, you know there's like a very unique type of drama that exists in nonprofit worlds, and like weird competition and weird like, oh, okay, I thought do we don't like them anymore? Like there's just, you work in this field long enough and you're like, okay, I guess that was something weird happened there and I don't know about it, right? We have to kind of push back on that and see ourselves as, you know what, we're going to do what we do and we're going to do it really well, and we're going to refer to you and we're going to support you so that you can do what you do and do it really, really well. And how do we collaborate and not compete, you know? That's like one of my, if I could do a TED Talk, it would be like nonprofit drama, because I just would love to dive deep into the psychology of that, but whatever, that's another presentation. So we also have to view individuals as a whole and look at them through the sociocultural lens. So remember, I mentioned when I talk about trauma, I always talk historical and institutional trauma. We cannot ignore the sociocultural factors that impact the way people heal from different trauma, the way they're going to receive different types of communication, the way they're going to respond to different environments. All of this is wrapped up in to all the pieces of who they are. This is intersectionality. We have to see all the identities of one person, how it intersects to create this unique experience for them. And just because we have one thing in common doesn't mean that we have the same lived experience. Just because I'm a woman talking to another woman doesn't mean that we've had the same experience, doesn't mean we're going to respond to things the same way. I've got to have that sociocultural lens, and I have to see them as a whole person. Trauma-informed care is strengths-based. It builds on strengths. It builds on positive traits. It's not deficit-based. It is not enough to say, hey, we're going to stop doing this. Hey, we're going to get rid of this. We have to be forward thinking, forward moving, strengths based, building on strengths, seeing strengths. We build trust and safety. We will not be able to connect with our clients and work with them on the really hard stuff until they're in that upper brain and they feel safe. An agency has to have trauma knowledge at all levels. It's not just the frontline staff. It's not just the people face to face with clients. It is the supervisors that have to be trauma informed. It's executive leadership that has to be trauma informed. It is the board of directors. They have to be trauma informed. They have to understand the needs of the communities we're serving. The people who write the grants and ask for the money and promise certain services, if we get certain money, they've got to have an understanding of trauma and what our communities need. And then the 6th one here is they have to address vicarious trauma. So what I find, because I've been doing this specific role, I've been doing this since 2019. And what I find is a lot of organizations, and I say this with love, okay, no judgment here, but a lot of organizations are way super on board for 1 through 5. And number 6 is where they get a little, sure, yeah, we don't want anyone to burn out. But there's still a lot of work to be done in this area, because number 6, addressing vicarious trauma, this is what your organization has to do for you, the employee. We are not fully trauma informed until we're doing this step. And our trauma informed care, 1 through 5, all those beautiful, sweet, amazing things that we want to do for our clients can't just be for our clients. We as workers and staff and employees need that to be mirrored and directed towards us as well. Okay. So that was a long intro. I promise I'll explain why I went through all of that, but that brings us to this deep dive that we're going to go on into vicarious trauma. This is the topic that I'm asked to present on most right now. more than any other topic I present on, more than any other specific type of victimization or intervention. I'm being asked to train on vicarious trauma, which is good. I think it means people are starting to pick it up, right? But vicarious trauma is just that negative effect of caring for other people. Okay. I'd love to open it up for you guys to share just in the chat, or unmute yourself if you're willing. I would appreciate it. When you think about or hear about vicarious trauma, or maybe even, when you decided to join in this session today, what does it mean to you? What comes to your mind when you hear or think vicarious trauma? What are the first things that you think of? What do you see? What do you feel? What stuck out to you about joining this session? What do we think of when we hear vicarious trauma? What does that mean to you? Compassion fatigue, absolutely. Yeah, it can mean compassion fatigue. What else? What does vicarious trauma mean to you? I'm going to type this out. Actually, you guys don't need me to do that. I also can't type and talk at the same time. So burnout, secondhand trauma, like we're going through it with them. Yeah, we're going through the trauma with the clients. We take on client trauma, so we're having similar symptoms. It's that bystander, transference, countertransference. It's therapist in the room, therapist speak. Caring for others can be exhausting, absolutely. Great, you guys are on it. No wrong answers. I just kind of want to know, what are we working with here? So absolutely. And like I said, this is what I'm asked to present on most right now. And I could theorize about why that is. Maybe because we still feel like we're kind of recovering from COVID, and that was like this massive wake-up call for everyone. I'm not sure, but we're really getting into this discussion systemically, I believe. So I'm excited. But yeah, vicarious trauma is the stress of engaging with survivors in their trauma symptoms, sort of navigating their trauma adaptive behaviors, reading between the lines of how they're acting and what they're saying, and not taking it personally, and trying to see the strength and see the resilience. It's that perspective that puts the effort to collaborate with survivors. So I was about to say, you all know this. It's very difficult when you're working with someone who's in survival mode to get them to feel safe, to get them to use that upper brain, to get them to start identifying, what do you need? What do you need to work on? This takes patience. This takes a lot of very active engagement, a lot of empathy. It really requires a lot of us, especially to try to be strength-based and see the survivor's resilience through all of that. It's the commitment and responsibility that we have to helping people. This all creates our vicarious trauma. And there's a reason that I start this presentation with the information on how trauma impacts our brain and behaviors and our views of the world, because our vicarious trauma, the neurobiology behind vicarious trauma, is exactly the same. We are mirroring the trauma symptoms and the trauma impact and the behaviors. We're mirroring that with our clients. We become avoidant, depressed, easily triggered. We start to live a little bit in this survival mode. We develop altered views about the world and about ourselves. We adapt to all of this in ways that might not always be healthy. We're not immune to the impact of this trauma. And if we don't address our vicarious trauma, then I'm afraid that we won't really be systems of healing and support. We are who they're coming to for help. Are we healthy and able to help them? Or are we going to be hurting these survivors out of our own unaddressed trauma? And like I said, I'm going to reiterate this 100 times. It's our ethical responsibility to be trauma-informed for our clients, but we also have a right to receive trauma-informed care ourselves. Because if we are feeling the same types of impact, we're mirroring it, we're feeling it, then we need similar care. We need similar trauma-informed lenses to be directed towards us from our organizations, from our supervisors, from our colleagues. Okay, so let's talk about vicarious trauma for a minute. probably longer than a minute. I don't know why I said that. It's going to be here for a while. So some key terms that help us understand vicarious trauma. First is secondary traumatic stress. So secondary traumatic stress is the acute stress reaction that we feel sort of when we've immediately experienced a client's traumatic experience, right? To use that word twice, right? This is those immediate responses that we feel when dealing with the really hard stuff. So this might be, you are immediately starting to feel that stress and anxiety. Your heart kind of starts racing because you're in a crisis position. Or you have a client and they're detailing their assault or abuse to you, and you're having to listen and absorb that and take that in. And, you notice for a couple days, you just can't shake that image, right? You can't quite seem to bounce back from that detailed story of their assault or abuse. It hits you kind of hard, and it's an acute reaction. Vicarious traumatization is that long-lasting, long-term change in how we see the world, ourselves, and our relationships as a result of being exposed to other people's trauma. And I do think that in this work, doing advocacy, therapy, and I don't know if there's very many law enforcement in the room, but just these front lines of sexual violence intervention, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious traumatization, I think that these are inevitable. I think we will take these on just by the nature of our work, okay? The third term here that I want to get into is burnout. And I am going to say before anything else, I do not believe burnout is inevitable. I don't believe we're destined to burn out, and I don't believe we deserve to burn out. Burnout is when we've reached that depletion. I'm emotionally exhausted. I feel disconnected. I'm depersonalized. I don't feel like I'm really active in this work anymore, and I'm not seeing any accomplishment from it. But I can remember, and if there's any other social workers in the room, I have 2 degrees in social work. And I remember even in my undergrad, early days, intro to social work, burnout was talked about like it was inevitable. There was this perspective of it's just nonprofit life, social worker life. What'd you expect becoming a social worker, right? It's just how it is. It was almost even yes, Erica in the chat, quote, that's just how it is. How many of us have heard that, right? It was almost seen as a strength of social work that if you get burnt out in one area, it's totally fine because there's so many other jobs you can go do. You get burnt out working in a hospital, that's great. Go work in drug rehab treatment. You get burnt out working in schools, amazing. Go work in CPS. You can go work anywhere. There's so many ways you can get burnt out. There is just no conversation happening around, is no one going to throw a wrench in this and try to stop the burnout in the first place? Why are we acting like this is inevitable? Why are we acting like this is what we deserve for doing this work? One of my kind of hot takes here and being in, working at a rape crisis center is some of the language of that's just how it is. What did you expect? That is some of the same hurtful language we hear people use when they talk about sexual assault. That's just, what did you expect going out, meeting up with that person, dressing like that? It's this weird, why are we blaming the people who are being hurt by this and acting like they should have known better? I don't like that. I'm throwing all of that out. We're wiping our memories of that. That is not our approach to burnout. We deserve to avoid burnout. Okay. We can avoid it, prevent it, and we deserve to do that. Okay. I have a lot of soapboxes. I have too many opinions for my own good. So I'm sorry if I get too passionate while I'm talking about this, but I believe we can avoid burnout. Okay. So I have a video for us. This video is, she created this specifically for people with ADHD, but she really only mentions that like once or twice, and it's relevant even if you don't have ADHD, but it's about burnout and giving us some good concepts to understand burnout. So if you don't have ADHD, just ignore that part. It doesn't apply to you, but if you do, maybe you'll appreciate it. And then we'll talk about it.
Hello, brains. Are you burned out? Have you been burned out? I feel like I'm burning out. Am I burned out? What is burnout? Burnout Noun is a state of physical, mental, or emotional exhaustion. The term was coined in the 1970s by the American psychologist Herbert Freudenberger, who used it to describe the consequences of severe stress and high ideals in helping professions. Since then, the concept has expanded to include any profession. The main researchers who study burnout define it as a psychological syndrome emerging as a prolonged response to chronic interpersonal stressors on the job. That doesn't mean things outside work can't create a sense of physical, mental, or emotional exhaustion, but for the purposes of this video, I want to clarify what we know about burnout in terms of what most mental health professionals probably mean when they use the term, which is occupational burnout. Why? The ICD-11, which is a diagnostic manual, includes burnout specifically as a workplace phenomenon and defines it as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. One of the brains explains it as soul-sucking emptiness and despair where caring and passion for my work used to exist. A lack of joy in success and mounting dread of my failures. Exhaustion, apathy, and dread every time I think about work. Desire to curl up and never move. Which is actually pretty accurate. According to ICD-11, occupational burnout isn't just about being tired. In fact, it's characterized by 3 dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. While employees are often quick to blame themselves and may even try to hide the fact that they're struggling, the researchers who study burnout recognize that it's a systemic issue caused by a mismatch between people and their work. And they've identified 6 dimensions in which those mismatches tend to happen. Workload, too much work, not enough resources. Control, micromanagement, lack of influence, accountability without power. Reward, which means not enough pay or acknowledgement or satisfaction. Community, which can include isolation, conflict, disrespect. Fairness, including discrimination, favoritism, and values, things like ethical conflicts or meaningless tasks. A few mismatches are tolerable, but significant mismatches or mismatches in areas that are important to someone can lead to burnout. Addressing those mismatches can increase engagement, which is protective against burnout. Burnout disproportionately affects those with ADHD and other mental health conditions, including PTSD. And currently, most workplaces don't do a great job of preventing it. In fact, they may encourage employees to push through it. But doing so actually makes it worse. Even once the stressor is over, the damage is done and often long-lasting. So burnout as a workplace phenomenon is a term we need to know and be able to talk about with our employers, employees, patients, and partners. Here are some helpful things to remember when talking about it. People don't burn out because they're weak. They burn out because of a mismatch between them and their work that they've pushed through long enough trying to be good employees that their brains and or bodies have essentially gone on strike and refused to keep working under these conditions. So reversing burnout isn't something they can do on their own by taking a vacation. They and the organization have to address the mismatch. Someone with ADHD excitedly hyper-focusing on a project and then being exhausted and needing recovery time is not the same as burnout. That's just how our brains work, and trying to force somebody to work differently in order to prevent burnout can actually contribute to it. So can taking work off our plate that we feel effective at and find rewarding. Again, it's about the fit between people and their work. When addressing burnout, we can't forget to account for the people part. Burnout is something that should be tackled in collaboration. Finally, addressing burnout is good for everyone. If it's caught early and the mismatches are addressed, it can be easy to recover from. But chronic burnout can take months or even years to get back to where we can work effectively. Employers and employees have the same goal, for the employee to be able to work well and contribute. And we can't do that if we're burned out.
Okay, so let me get her face off the screen for a second. So what did we think about that? What stood out to us? I'd love to hear in the chat what stood out to us about that video. Learn anything? Did it give us anything new to think about?
I think it actually kind of expands a little bit. Yes, sorry.
No,
Can you
good.
hear me?
I'm so happy. I was staring at the chat, and I'm so happy to hear. Yes, please continue.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it kind of expands a little bit more into the concept of burnout, because everybody's used to hearing the concept burnout. Everybody understands what it's burnout. We know what it means, what it entails, but to go deeper into what it actually is, it's a little bit refreshing, to say the least, just to
Yeah.
get into the details, into the weeds
Yeah.
of everything and how everything works. So Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm reading in the chat, it doesn't have to be taboo to talk about burnout, right? It doesn't mean that you're weak. I love anytime I'm talking about professional, our vicarious trauma, I try as much as possible to take all the ways that we support and empower survivors and direct that towards us, right? So one of our sort of go-to sayings here at the Women's Center, and probably across the board, not unique to us, but how you respond to trauma, it's a normal response to an abnormal circumstance, right? What happened to you was not normal. How you responded was normal, and you're not weak because of how you responded, right? And I think it's important to feel the same about burnout. My burnout doesn't mean I'm weak. It doesn't mean I'm not suited for this job. It doesn't mean I can't do it, right? It can happen, but it is preventable. Somebody said, having something you like being taken away from you stuck out for me. That's Evangeline in the chat. Put a pin in that because I'm going to come back to it. That stood out for me as well. And I'll actually talk about that when I give some supervisors, if there's any supervisors in the room, give you some advice on what to do. The damage can be long-term. It's not fixed with one little day off. It's a mismatch in our work. And I like that because it sort of takes the blame off of anybody. And instead just says, this is a mismatch. This is just a mismatch. And you know what? We can adjust mismatch. We can fix that, right? Nobody here is broken beyond repair. No organization is broken beyond repair. If I believed that, I would quit my job, right? I wouldn't be doing this work. I believe systemic change is possible. So there's a mismatch and we can address that. Recovering takes more than just the individual effort. There's no push through. You can't just push through it. Yes, companies that just try to tell their employees, push through it, keep going, you're strong, you're tough, you got this. That actually can make our burnout worse. And yeah, it affects everyone. It's not just an individual issue, right? So this is going to be a little random, but I did a presentation a few weeks ago, and one of my evaluations said that I have a tick of saying the word right. Like that's my go-to word. And so now it's all I can hear. And now I said it and it's all you're going to be able to hear. I shouldn't have said anything, but I keep hearing myself say it. So I'm really sorry if that gets annoying to you guys. I'm going to try to find a different word. All right. So let's look at, how does burnout manifest for us? How do we see our burnout in ourselves? What are some of the areas here that this shows up? So mental, these are feelings of, I'm feeling empty. I feel like I'm trapped in my job. I'm easily frustrated. I can't concentrate, easily overwhelmed by what used to be normal workload now feels impossible to me. I work for 5 minutes and I feel like I worked for an hour, right? A simple request from your supervisor just feels like the straw that broke the camel's back. And it's too much for me. Our physical symptoms, this can be some of that psychosomatic or chronic fatigue, can't sleep, can't wake up, right? We can't fall asleep or we can't get up in the morning. Behavioral symptoms, we might be hyperactive, we kind of can't calm down, or we're really sluggish. We have no motivation for those healthy habits that we've tried to build. We might fall back on some unhealthy habits. We see it socially. So we withdraw from friendships, we isolate ourselves, we have that lone wolf approach. We've all worked with those people that they come in, they go to their office, they do their job, they leave. They don't build connections, they don't build relationships, they don't feel like it serves them, right? That's a lone wolf mentality. I don't think that that's a healthy approach to this job, right? Negative spillover to our home life. So we see it affecting our families and our personal relationships, in our attitudes. So especially something important to note, and that really stood out to me reading research about this, was the more we run out of that intrinsic motivation. So the less I feel like I'm in touch with my inner drive, my inner passion, the things that really motivate me to do this work, the more I'm going to rely on, what are you going to do for me? What PTO are you going to give me? What salary raise you're going to give me? What tangible benefits are you going to give me? The more I've run out of that intrinsic motivation, the more I'm going to be relying on someone else and something else to motivate me, What we need is a balance of those. We need a balance of external and internal, but we have to understand that our burnout is going to create a real depletion of that internal motivator. And we're going to become really hypercritical, and no effort or strategy or policy is going to be good enough for us. We find ourselves looking for the negative element, the negative aspect of every change, every email that comes from executive leadership with a new policy, new change. We look at it like, oh God, here we go. What are they going to make us do now? Right? We have that hypercriticism. And then organizations see this in high turnover, high rates of absenteeism, and lowered productivity. So and we also see, sorry, I keep jumping ahead. That's okay. I'm just getting excited to talk about certain parts of this. We also see this vicarious traumatization. Remember, vicarious traumatization is specifically talking about the changes in our views about the world, ourselves, and the future. The changes in how we see other people, what we think about the future, how hopeless or hopeful we feel, and how we see ourselves. We begin to have altered perspectives on the world and others as a result of the trauma that we've been exposed to and the stress that we take on at work. We also adapt. Like I said, we're not immune to any of this impact. We have these symptoms of burnout. We have this secondhand stress, this trauma we experience at work. But guess what? We still have to get up every day and get paid. So we find ways to adapt and cope. We are all doing the best that we can to adapt and cope. Our responsibility is to be mindful of, what are my trauma adaptive behaviors? How have I developed or changed or grown? Or maybe what am I falling back on? Maybe some unhealthy habits that is helping me to just deal with the stress of my job. So we're going to stop and reflect for a second. And this is, again, where I'd love to hear in the chat. This is our exercise in vulnerability. If you're in this session and you have coworkers in the session, or maybe a supervisor in the session, and you want to talk about something about your job that's hard, just lie and say it's about another job, right? We can share openly here. But obviously I don't want anyone to share anything about work that they're, not comfortable sharing. Stay quiet if you want to stay quiet. That's totally fair. But stop and reflect on these three areas: your burnout, your vicarious trauma, and your trauma adaptive behavior. So let's first look at burnout. How do you notice that you're feeling burned out? What are some of your warning signs? Remember that mental, physical, social, emotional, I think professional, right? How do you notice that you're burning out? Where are your signs? What are your warning signs? So for me, when a big red flag to me that I'm burning out is when I have no time, energy. I cannot handle any more social interaction with people. I cannot. I've got to cut. I'm canceling on my best friends. I'm canceling time with my husband, with my family. I'm just saying I don't have any time. I don't have any energy. I can't hear about another person's life. Oversleep. Good. I'm going to read some. I love that y'all are sharing in the chat. Easily irritable. I self-isolate more when it starts to hit the burnout's coming. Low on patience. Binge on video games to live in a virtual world. I love that. That's exactly right. And that's not bad to play video games, but it's exactly what you're noticing. Exactly what I'm talking about. The ability to say, oh, I think this is a sign that I'm feeling something deeper. I want to just be on my own. Some of that isolation. Absolutely. So now let's look at our views about the world, the future, and ourselves. So remember, our vicarious traumatization, it's changes in what we believe about ourselves, what we believe about the world. Do you see the world differently? Do you see the future differently? Do you see yourself differently? So I think particularly for us in the field of sexual violence, sexual assault, I know I see this in myself coming from rape crisis, is just looking at the people around me and having this internal message of, I never really know anybody. You can't ever really trust anybody. You think you know someone, you think you can trust someone, you really never can. That's a deeply held view about the world that has changed from doing work in trauma and sexual violence particularly. So how have you guys seen the way I view the world, the way I view myself, the way I feel about the future? Has that changed since doing this work? Yeah, I scan everyone I see for protective behaviors. Always sort of, I know, I do the same thing. I kind of look at everyone a little bit, are they acting a little different? Are they making me uncomfortable? Are they making someone else uncomfortable? I'm sort of scanning all the time. What else? How else do you guys see? The way I educate my kids about safe people in their own bodies. That's good. Super high alert for human trafficking, thinking I'm seeing it everywhere, getting anxious in crowds. Absolutely. Being concerned for our kids' safety. Yeah, I can't help but see the world as victim, perpetrator. Right. And this is my vulnerability, and I'm not even, this is us just being honest. Obviously, we recognize some of these are healthy, some of these are not. I think something that I've noticed in myself is the way I view men. And I know men are victims of sexual violence too, and not all perpetrators are men. I know the data, I know the stats, but I've heard so many stories over and over again that it really has shaped I look at some of the men in my life that I know and love and trust, and I have these thoughts of like, are you really that good of a guy? Do I really know you? I think I know you, but can you ever really know anybody? It just really has messed with my head in that sense. Going into advocate, oh my goodness. Oh no. Go into advocate mode when friends and family disclose situations to me that have red flags. Oh my God. You're like speaking my language on that. Yes. That's one of well, I'll get into that, but it's almost like you get a sixth sense for when someone is just, you're getting to know them and they start to talk about their family or talk about their childhood, and you kind of start to realize, oh, I think this person's about to disclose trauma to me. I think this person's about to disclose something to me. Or you realize like, oh my God, that's an abusive situation. What you're describing to me as normal to you, I'm thinking, so somebody here is being hurt. It is that red flag, and that's exhausting. And then we can't take the hat off of, okay, what do I do? What do I do to help? I gotta help. I'm not gonna stop thinking about this person until I help, right? Ooh, you put perfect words to that, Alma. And the last one here is, how have we coped? How have we adapted? You guys have touched on a few of these, but what are my mechanisms to cope with burnout? So one that I always give is a very specific example for me, but one of my first jobs in social work, I always exited, I took the same exit off the highway every day, obviously, to get to work. And so I felt so much stress and burnout from this job that just taking that specific exit off the highway would trigger me. I would start going into my preparation mode I'm prepared to feel stressed. I'm prepared to feel overwhelmed. I'm prepared to feel anxious. What's going to face me today? What am I going to encounter today? Just taking the exit triggered all of that in me. So if it was a weeknight or a weekend and I had to go somewhere in that direction, I had to avoid the highway. I couldn't drive past that exit. Just driving past the exit was too much for me. So my trauma adaptive behavior was I would GPS and find other routes to get where I needed to go so that I wouldn't have to deal with that. That is not healthy. The exit of the highway was not what was causing me any stress, but that was my best attempt from where I was and what I had to deal with that stress. I've heard from people who have said, I had to circle the building or sit in my car for like 30 minutes before my shift just to work up the energy to going in, just because there was so much of what am I going to deal with today? And this can also be something like exercise, right? I exercise, I kind of throw myself in, I burn my physical body out so that I don't have to, my mind's not racing so much, right? Or it matches how I feel mentally. But how have you coped? How do you cope with your burnout? How have you adapted to your vicarious trauma? Let me hear from some of you guys. How have you adapted? And this is not our self-care. We'll talk self-care. These are the things that you've done to adapt, to just deal with it, to get through every day. Leaving work when I don't have anything important to do. Oh, that sounds actually kind of nice. But yeah, maybe skipping out when you shouldn't. What else? How do you guys cope? What are your trauma adaptive behaviors? Setting boundaries. Yes, journaling before leaving the office. That way I leave it at the office. Excess coffee and energy drinks. Thank you. That's so, let's be honest, talk and process with my coworker, venting to my work bestie and then feeling guilty for doing it. Walk outside between clients to get different air on my skin for sure. Leaving work at work. Absolutely. Some of these boundaries are good, right? Some of them aren't. I used to be chronically late. Yeah, never done that before my advocacy role. Dark sense of humor. Absolutely. Absolutely. A good example here is, maybe you dump all of the trauma from your work on your partner or on your friends, or you swing to the other side of the pendulum and you never talk about your work ever, right? You have no in between. Very loud gangster music. Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Right, get it out. I just bear it, but knowing I have the gym or a friend to go to after work helps. Yeah, anybody else? Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts in the chat? How do you adapt? A therapist of my own, absolutely. So, boxing, happy hour, started therapy, caffeine, right? So I hope that we can see, again, if we have similar or mirrored trauma symptoms, trauma behaviors, and we start to mirror that, we have to also recognize we're going to adapt the best that we can. And the same strengths-based perspective we want to use for our clients, we also want to use that for ourselves and have some of that grace for ourselves. You know what? I'm doing the best that I can. I'm doing the best I can with what I have to cope with what I've been through. Okay. So now we're going to move on. I'm going to show another video, and then we're going to move into what do we do about this vicarious trauma? What are some strategies for us to addressing it? Okay.
Secondary traumatic stress is a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. And you can see I'm trying to emphasize this. So I don't want folks in the room that might feel like you're experiencing these things to feel like there's something wrong with you, or I would say the opposite. And I think that much like having ACEs happen over and over and over again and how that impacts us, hearing about people who have experienced ACEs over and over and over again can certainly have an impact on us. Self-care is an ethical imperative. We have an obligation to our clients as well as to ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work that we do. I think it's interesting that many of our professions have codes of ethics that deal with how we treat our clients, and that's essential. But we don't say much about how we treat each other or how we treat ourselves. And I think this would be a paradigm shift that would be helpful. How many of you have heard of burnout? Experienced burnout? See a few liars in the room? Yeah, yes you have, okay, anyway.
Okay. So a few, I forgot that I have this in here, but a few risk factors. So some things that do put us at risk for vicarious trauma. I have some of those listed out here. But I want to talk for just a minute about self-efficacy. So when we have low self-efficacy at our job, this is a big risk factor for burnout. So this was a really interesting piece of just reading the research around this. Self-efficacy is really your sense of voice, your sense of control, and the power that you have in whatever role you're in. And we can have self-efficacy in the task domain, which is just, what's your job? I know how to do my job. I can do my job well. I've got a good sense of mastery over that. Self-efficacy in the interpersonal domain is, I feel like my voice is being heard with my coworkers, my relationships, my clients. I have a sense of say. I'm able to work well with them. Arguably the most influential factor here of self-efficacy is the organizational domain. And this is your ability to influence the organization that you work in. Do you have a way to speak to power in your organization? Is your voice heard when something goes right or something goes wrong? Are you able to speak on that? Do you have transparency and training on how the organization is structured and who makes the big decisions? Okay, so self-efficacy, if we don't have this sense of empowerment at our work, we are at a higher risk of vicarious trauma and burnout. All right, so what do we do? So remember that we talked about trauma-informed care, and what are all the things that have to be present for an agency to be trauma-informed? And that trauma-informed care is not just for our clients, it is for us as well. It is us feeling safe where we work. It is our ability to trust our organization, our supervisors, colleagues, ourselves. It's us feeling empowered, feeling like we get to collaborate and we have a voice. It is shifting our perspective from what is wrong with me? Why am I so tired? Why am I practicing just like unhealthy coping mechanisms? Why do I hate coming to work every day? Why do I feel like I'm running on empty? And instead asking ourselves, what has happened? And recognizing I'm doing the best that I can. Okay. I want to start though with talking about organization. So to date, most of the research tends to suggest that adverse organizational conditions are more significant in the etiology of burnout than our personality factors. Adverse organizational conditions are more significant in the etiology of burnout than our personality factors. What does this quote mean to you? What do you think this is telling us? What is this telling us? That adverse organizational conditions are more significant with burnout than personality factors. Yeah, workplace culture has a lot to do with burnout. Instead of, not just us, the workplace leadership is more important than coworkers. It's a lack of concern from the workplace. Absolutely. I think this to me feels very empowering to say, it is not my personal failure that is causing me to feel burned out. Okay. If we can recognize that it's not a personal failure, it is a systemic issue, then maybe we need to look into some primary prevention of burnout and vicarious trauma, the same way we want to do primary prevention of sexual violence. It's not enough to just say, hey, don't be a victim. We know that is outdated prevention of sexual violence. Don't be a victim, right? We've even moved beyond, hey, be a good bystander. That's true. We want people to intervene, but we've moved beyond just bystander intervention. If we're really going to talk about, hey, let's prevent violence from happening in the first place, I'd love to see us apply that same approach to professional burnout. Okay. I want to read some more in the chat. So you're more likely, what this quote means to us, you're more likely to feel the burnout. Higher ups do things to make you feel insignificant. An adverse work environment can lead to burnout faster than working with clients despite the trauma that they share. Yeah, it's not the clients burning me out. It's you, not me, right? So instead of it's not you, it's me, it's like we're being told it's you, it's not us, it's you. Absolutely. So what can our organizations do? So a lot of this one is going to be directed towards, if anyone in this presentation is a supervisor or has any sort of authority or power at their organization, these are going to be some things that we need to see from you. Some encouragement of some changes I'd love to see you take back with you. And if some of you are in here and you're thinking, I have zero power, if you have a supervisor and they've got ears and you've got a voice, go tell them, right? Go tell them these are the things I'd really like to see changing. And can we be working on some of this, right? Because this organizational job, this addressing vicarious trauma as an organization, I really believe it's the responsibility of our workplace. The key decision makers, the ones who determine policies and procedures, that is who has to understand how their decisions contribute to our burnout. Right? We have the power to do our own self-care, but we deserve to work somewhere that supports this. And think about all the advocacy we do for survivors. We advocate for survivors to be believed, to be supported. We don't tell them to just suck it up or pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but that's often the very attitude of our professional field. We've already talked about it, that's just how it is. We're not in it for the money. We're trying to see these systemic changes, though. We deserve to be supported in the work that we do. We deserve to see systemic change in these organizations, to be more supportive in addressing our vicarious trauma. So a few ways that we want to see that. One, we've got to have a balance of autonomy and support, not total autonomy all the time. I know when I'm burning out, because I start to think, I just don't want anyone to ever tell me what to do. I want to be able to work by myself on my own and be in charge of everything that happens to me. That is not actually what I want, because I would get very stressed out very quickly if that was my reality. I also need support. We need a balance of autonomy and support. That is what creates a feeling of competence. And feeling competent is more important than feeling like I can do whatever I want. Feeling like I know what's expected of me and I'm supported to get it done. That's a far more empowering feeling than just being left alone. Providing continuous training. So having really well planned out orientation experiences, that onboarding process for somebody. I remember when I first got my job at the Women's Center, there were months, it was months of onboarding and shadowing and observing. And I was so sick of it by the end of it. I was like, oh my God, let me please go do things by myself. And my supervisor at the time was very gently reminding me, like, you're going to be really grateful you had this time. And a year from now, when you're on your own all the time, you're going to be grateful you had this onboarding, this shadowing. That built a foundation for me of understanding everybody's role in the organization, how everyone works, what everyone does, and it has made me better, okay? Having trainings and trainings that are really transparent, especially when it comes to here's how our organization is structured. Here's our funding sources. Here's who writes our grants. Here's our board of directors, and having transparency in that so that everyone in the agency feels like, I know what's going on. I can see how decisions are made. I'm hearing from leadership on how decisions are made, and I have a voice here. Supervision and consultation. Too many supervisors are just as burnt out and overwhelmed as the people they're supervising, so they can't actually do their job, which is supervising, right? Supervisors have to have space and room for developing their staff, developing leaders, making sure that everyone can do what they need to do. And a supervisor that has your back, knowing that I work somewhere, they're going to have my back. If something's going on with me personally, professionally, I'm seen as a whole person here and I'm supported. That is a huge prevention factor for burnout. Having goals that are attainable and challenging. So if we remember in that video, she talked about things being taken off our plate that we really enjoy. I was working with an organization a few weeks ago on preparing them to do some of this vicarious trauma work. And the supervisor that I was working with, she said, well, a group of her staff have decided to, take on planning fun things for the department. And she was considering, I'm going to take it off their plate because I don't want them to feel overworked. It was totally from a good place. She's like, I don't want them to be overwhelmed. I don't want them to be burned out. But I remembered that burnout video that I show, and I said, hold on, they might really take a lot of joy from doing that. If we're going to take stuff off of our staff's plate, we can't just do it blindly. We have to understand, well, what's going to actually help you feel more supported and productive? I don't want to take away the part of your job that you actually love the most. That's not going to help you. That's going to make you feel even like you have less autonomy, less self-efficacy. Having a strong ideological community. When I'm doing this in person, especially when I'm doing this at one organization, I always do the pop quiz of, do you know what your agency's mission statement is? And do you have it memorized? And do you ever think about it? That's not just lip service. That's not just something that we put on our flyers. We have to have a strong, clear idea of what is our mission, what's our goal, what's our purpose, and staying in that lane. We don't want to be, it's kind of like when imagine you're bowling. It's so much easier to bowl when you have those bumpers on, because you're not hopping around the place and going in all these other lanes and going into the gutter every time. You have that guidance, you have that buffer. What is my purpose? What's my mission? Having a strong ideological community is going to prevent some of that burnout. Having clear boundaries. So it's not enough for me to practice boundaries. My agency has to practice boundaries with me as well. It's not enough for me to over and over and over again have to say no to things. That's a great practice for myself, is saying no, and no is a complete sentence, and I'm not going to be able to do that task. But it's another thing if I keep getting asked, right? I keep being expected to do overtime, above and beyond, something that I don't feel comfortable with. So having an agency that says, here are our boundaries. We don't do this. We don't ask our staff to do this. Or sometimes having a supervisor that helps their staff set boundaries. We're going to say no to this. I know you want to do it, but I think you've got a lot on your plate this week. We're going to say no. Or you have you worked late last night. When are you flexing that time? When are you going to make up for that? You don't need to be here. We're fine without you. Having some of those boundaries. Opportunities for social support. So one of my big beliefs in this work is that time spent investing in connection between your staff is never time wasted. That is an investment that pays dividends. Investing in time with your staff to build connections, having spaces where they can share honestly and authentically about their work. As a supervisor, being comfortable that some of that sharing is not always going to be positive, feel good, happy, having room for that, having room for your team to have fun together. It might feel like, okay, this is a wasted afternoon. We can't put this on a grant report. We're not making money doing this. This isn't increasing our productivity. The payoff might be years later when you have a far more resilient staff and way lower rates of turnover. Okay, I believe that this is a long-term payoff. And even if it's not increased productivity, it's good for the real human people in your organization. They deserve to be supported and to be treated like real full human people. So creating space for connection, relationship, fun, food, relaxing, that is never time wasted. And then encouraging your staff and having room and no judgment and complete respect for how they pursue their own therapy and their own self-care. Okay, we're doing good on time. So the last thing we're going to talk about here is just that. We're going to talk about that self-care. Now, this is my final soapbox of the afternoon. And boy, do I have a soapbox when it comes to self-care. I have been in this field for probably 10 years now, give or take. And so I have sat through many a self-care training, as I'm sure a lot of you have as well. And most of what I take away from those self-care trainings at best is it's like a Band-Aid intervention being put on systemic problems. At worst, those trainings on self-care end up making me feel like I'm being blamed for my own burnout. I'm being blamed for not magically recovering from toxic or traumatic environments. And it's my fault. And it's what do I have to do to come back from that? That is not trauma informed. That is not strengths based. That is not aligned with what we're talking about. That is not a trauma informed way. Self-care is not a Band-Aid, and it is not a quick fix. True self-care is a preventative discipline. It is something you invest in even when things are going good. You are investing in your own care, your own resilience. You are building up this buffer for yourself so that when something really hard happens at work, because it is inevitable, that secondary traumatic stress and that vicarious traumatization is coming. It's going to happen. You can't avoid it. Are you preventing your burnout? Are you investing in the discipline of self-care? It sometimes is going to be things that don't always feel good. If anybody here has seen Parks and Rec, there's that whole bit on Parks and Rec of treat yourself, right? Buy whatever you want, eat whatever you want, do whatever you want. That's not true self-care. Self-care is a discipline. It's a practice that we invest in, is where we care for ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. It also includes our professional life. Okay, so if you listen to that last section of all the things organizations have to do, and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, dang, the place I work isn't doing any of that. Well, your professional self-care challenge is to schedule a meeting with your supervisor and say, hey, what can we do differently here? I just went to a presentation where they were outlining all these strategies for how we can prevent vicarious trauma in the workplace. Can we try some of these things? Y'all, this is evidence-based. I'm not smart enough to come up with this. I'm telling you the research that way smarter people have put together. That's your professional self-care. Sometimes being that person who speaks up and says, hey, this isn't working for me. I don't think this is working for our clients. This isn't working for the team. That's hard to do, but that's a discipline. That's something I do because I invest in myself. Challenging yourself to learn new things, giving yourselves opportunities to be creative. Financial self-care, budgeting, saving, being responsible. I'd love, while I move on to the final section, if you guys want to share what you do for self-care, I would love that, just so everyone can kind of get some ideas. But then we're going to finish up with the concept of vicarious resilience. So this is sort of the other side of the coin. Okay. Vicarious resilience is that balance to the negative effects of this traumatic work. Okay. It's like the ultimate step in having a trauma-informed practice, because it's more than preventing burnout or addressing burnout. And it's more than addressing vicarious trauma. It is enhancing and increasing vicarious resilience. Prevention of vicarious trauma is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have to foster vicarious resilience as the other side of that coin. It's equally critical. Investing in our compassion satisfaction, that's that sense of fulfillment we get, the sense of personal achievement that we gain from this work. And then vicarious post-traumatic growth are those long-term changes in ourselves, those long-term positive changes. I am more resilient because of this work. I am more hopeful because of my work. I'm more resourceful. I have been transformed for the better by doing this work. I don't do self-care just to survive my job. The work itself enhances my resiliency. The work itself is a part of my thriving and flourishing because I see the growth I get to take from it. So the last thing I'm going to ask you to share on is, how has this work? So we've talked about all the traumatic impact. So I want us to end on a little more of a positive, empowering note. How has this work changed you for the better? How has your work with survivors of crime, survivors of abuse, victims of assault, vulnerable people, how has your work changed you for the better? And what is your why? Why do you keep doing this work? What keeps you every day working, coming back, showing up? What is your why? So how has this work changed you for the better? And why do you keep doing it? So someone said, I'm more compassionate. What else? Mine is, my intrinsic motivation, my why is that it's a privilege to do work that I'm passionate about. I could quit this job, probably go get paid more at a boring desk job that I didn't care about, that wouldn't fulfill me in any way. I'd get no compassion satisfaction from that. And I have learned over the years, I thrive in that. I thrive in doing work that I'm passionate about. That's my why. Someone said, I'm much more confident. Being able to help others has made me stronger. Absolutely. So how has this work changed you for the better? What is your why? We've just got a few more minutes, but I'd love to hear people, chime in, unmute yourself, or put it in the chat. But how has this work changed you for the better? And why do you keep doing it? I'm more empathetic. Absolutely. Thank you. Anybody else? I keep learning and growing to better serve my clients. They help me recognize my own areas of growth as a professional. Absolutely. We have to be continual learners in this field. Nothing is black and white in the area that we're working in, and that keeps us on our toes, right? We have to continually be open to what's changing, what's new, what are the needs of our communities. I'm passionate about helping others and helping my coworkers be able to find their own why. Absolutely. I feel the reward of seeing that I'm able to actually make a difference in someone's life. It has made me more aware of other underserved communities. I've learned so much in this job and work, and my why is educating others about DV, SA, and survivors. Exponential growth personally, overcoming my own trauma. My why is that I get to educate people on how to be what we want to see in the world. I can be the help that my family once needed. We didn't know of community resources. We didn't even have a name for it. Seeing clients thrive gives me joy, and this work continues to educate me. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you being here for this. Please continue to drop stuff in the chat. We've got about 6 minutes left in our time slot here. My email address is here on the screen, Chelsea Davis, cdavis@womencentertc.org. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Let me know if this meant anything to you, if anything, you want to hear more about something, or read more about some of the research that I got to look through for this. Just let me know, and I'd love to hear from you. And I thank you guys so much for being here and for listening to me talk for an hour and a half. I appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, it was wonderful. Thank you so much, Chelsea. Everybody, I will just say, like, whether it's in the chat or with like Zoom reactions, can we please give like some good energy and gratitude to Chelsea for such a wonderful workshop and for supporting us as folks in the field. Yeah, you're getting all kinds of reactions, claps, like little.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
But yeah, everyone, I know I dropped it a couple times. Please don't forget to take a moment. Don't wait, evaluate. Let us know feedback about the whole virtual conference. Thank you for attending here. And I think I see someone with their hand raised. So we are going to keep this link open until 3. So if folks have questions, Chelsea, if you have little last thoughts. Yes.
Oh, I'm open for questions. Yeah, I don't have any final thoughts. I'm totally done, but so, y'all are free to go, but if anyone does want to stay and ask a few questions, I would love, I think whoever's hand was up, please just shout out what you need. I think it was Kathy. Maybe it was on accident, but that's okay.
That's also a real thing. Been there.
Yeah, right. But yeah, thanks for all the kind words, everybody. I really appreciate it. It's probably my favorite topic to present on, so y'all made it easy. Oh, I think are all the recorded presentations available? Someone asked. They might have already left, but.
Yes. So thank you for pointing that question out. I totally missed that. They will be available after the conference, and they'll be available around about July 28th until September 30th. And we'll send out a post-conference email to make sure everyone has all the links for everything, materials, recordings, all that. So the answer is yes, even though I know that was a long way to answer.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you, Madison, for all your help. I appreciate it. Keeping an eye on the chat for me and letting everyone in. It's so much to try to keep an eye on the waiting room and do the chat and